The long night at Ashwick House. The train to Ashwick pulled into the station as the last rays of daylight bled into the horizon. Violet stepped off the carriage, clutching her suitcase in one hand and a crumpled letter in the other. The station was deserted, save for a distant figure loading sacks onto a cart. A low mist crept across the ground, blurring the edges of reality. She glanced at the letter once more, the words written in her Aunt Evelyn's trembling hand. "Come at once. I need you. Ashwick House isn't safe anymore." Violet had hesitated for days before answering the plea. She had not seen Evelyn in years, not since her mother's funeral, and her memories of Ashwick House were murky at best. A labyrinthine mansion nestled deep in the woods, with corridors that seemed to shift and echo. But Evelyn's words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The driver of the station cart waved her over without speaking, his face shrouded in shadow. The ride through the woods was silent save for the crunch of wheels on gravel. Branches arched overhead, forming a tunnel that seemed to draw her deeper into darkness. When the cart finally stopped, Violet's breath caught in her throat. Ashwick House loomed before her, taller and more decrepit than she remembered. Its windows reflected the pale light of the rising moon, and the stone facade seemed alive, crawling with vines that pulsed faintly as if with breath. A single light flickered in an upper window, and Violet thought she saw a silhouette move across it. Inside, the house felt colder than the night air. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of damp wood and something metallic. Evelyn's voice called to her from the parlor, weak and hoarse. Violet followed the sound, her heels clicking against the worn floorboards. Evelyn sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, a blanket draped over her thin frame. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pallid, but she managed a frail smile when Violet entered. "I didn't think you'd come," she whispered. "You said you needed me," Violet replied, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong?" Evelyn's gaze flicked toward the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. "It's the house. It's awake again." Violet frowned, but before she could ask what she meant, Evelyn gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't go wandering tonight. Lock your door. Whatever you hear, don't open it." Violet's room was as she remembered it, austere and cold, with a single bed and a wardrobe that creaked whenever she moved. The fireplace was long extinguished, leaving the room bathed in shadow. She locked the door as Evelyn had instructed, but unease prickled at her skin. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of an old clock in the hallway. She tried to sleep, but the whispers began just after midnight. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Violet pressed her ear to the headboard, but the sound vanished. Moments later, it returned, louder and more insistent, like voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, her heart pounding. The doorknob rattled. Violet froze. The rattling grew more violent, accompanied by a low growl that seemed to reverberate through the entire house. The shadows in the corners of her room thickened, coalescing into shapes that twisted and writhed. She stumbled out of bed, backing into the farthest corner as the temperature in the room plummeted. The door flew open with a deafening crash, though no one stood on the other side. The hallway beyond was pitch black, an impenetrable void. Violet's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the threshold, unable to look away. From the darkness, something moved. It was not a person. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs bending in unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by a featureless mask of shadow, but its eyes, pale, luminous orbs, pierced through the darkness, locking onto her. The thing stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. Violet screamed. When she awoke, she was back in bed, the door locked as if it had never been opened. Her body ached, and her hands were raw, her nails broken and caked with dirt. She stared at the ceiling, trying to steady her breathing. Had it been a nightmare? The whispers started again. This time they formed words, "Come downstairs." Violet shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She couldn't ignore them. Trembling, she unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was darker than before, the air thick with a choking fog. The walls seemed to pulse, the wallpaper bulging outward as if something were trying to push through. The staircase groaned beneath her weight as she descended, each step echoing like a gunshot. In the parlor, the fire was still burning, but Evelyn was gone. The chair where she had sat was overturned, the blanket discarded on the floor. Violet called out, her voice trembling, but only silence answered. Then she saw it, a trail of dark, wet footprints leading toward the cellar door. The cellar was worse than she remembered. The air was damp and fetid, the stone walls slick with moss and something darker. She followed the footprints down the narrow steps, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows here were alive, shifting and writhing as if aware of her presence. At the bottom she found Evelyn. She was standing with her back to Violet, staring at the far wall. "Aunt Evelyn?" she whispered. Evelyn turned slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. Her eyes were wide, her pupils blown, and her mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice layered with something deeper, something inhuman. The walls began to bleed. Dark rivulets seeped from the stone, pooling on the floor as the air filled with a deafening roar. The shadows erupted, taking form, their limbs stretching toward Violet. She turned to run but found the stairs gone, replaced by an endless void. The shadows closed in, their cold fingers wrapping around her throat as Evelyn's laughter echoed in her ears. When Violet woke, she was lying in the forest, the ruins of Ashwick House smoldering behind her. The memories of what had happened were fragmented, slipping through her fingers like smoke. She stumbled to her feet, her body aching, and fled toward the distant lights of the village. Months later she would find herself standing before a mirror, unable to look away as Evelyn's face stared back at her, smiling that impossible smile. And in the darkest hours of the night, she would hear the whispers again. "Come back." In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. The Shadows of Blackwood Hollow. Blackwood Hollow was a town forgotten by time. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was a place where the forest stretched thick and unyielding, where the sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy. The townsfolk lived simple lives, and though they rarely spoke of it, they all knew there was something wrong with the hollow. When Evelyn Marlowe arrived, she thought she was escaping her own demons. The death of her husband and the relentless whispers of scandal had driven her from the city, seeking solitude in the house her grandmother had left her. Blackwood House stood at the edge of the hollow, a grand Victorian with peeling paint and sagging gables. It had once been a place of laughter, but now it loomed, silent and watchful, as though the forest itself were trying to reclaim it. The first night was quiet. Evelyn unpacked her belongings, her movements slow and deliberate as she navigated the creaking floors. The house was dusty but otherwise untouched, as though it had been waiting for her return. She found photographs of her grandmother and great-grandparents in the study, their eyes always seeming to follow her, no matter where she stood. It wasn't until the second night that Evelyn began to notice the peculiarities. She was sitting in the parlor, the flickering light of the fire her only company, when she heard it. A soft knock, faint and rhythmic, coming from the walls. She froze, listening. It stopped, then started again, slower this time, almost hesitant. She told herself it was the house settling, the old wood groaning in the night air. But deep down she knew it wasn't. The next morning she found scratches on the inside of the pantry door, long and jagged, as though something had been trying to claw its way out. She stared at them for a long time before closing the door and walking away. By the end of the week, the knocking had grown louder. It followed her through the house, shifting from wall to wall, floor to ceiling. At first she tried to ignore it. Then she began to knock back, her heart racing as she waited for a response. Sometimes there was none. Other times the knocks came faster, angrier. The whispers began on the 8th night. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But as the hours stretched on, they grew louder, overlapping and blending into an incomprehensible murmur. Evelyn sat in her bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, her eyes darting toward the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then a single word: "Leave." Evelyn tried to convince herself it was all in her head, the product of too many sleepless nights and too much isolation. She started leaving the lights on, every lamp in every room blazing to chase away the darkness. But it didn't help. The shadows grew deeper, more defined, as though the light only made them stronger. One evening, as she sat at the dining room table, she felt a hand brush against her shoulder. She spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices only grew stronger, until they seemed to be coming from inside her own head. The mirror in the hallway shattered that night. Evelyn found it the next morning, the glass scattered across the floor like frozen tears. When she looked at her reflection in the shards, her face seemed wrong, twisted and unfamiliar, her eyes too dark. The forest began to close in around the house. Evelyn noticed it on a foggy morning when she stepped onto the porch. The trees seemed closer than they had been the day before, their gnarled branches reaching toward the house like grasping fingers. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath her feet felt soft as though it might swallow her whole. She started hearing footsteps in the hallways at night, slow and deliberate. The first time she thought it might be an intruder, but when she opened her door, the hallway was empty. Still, the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, as if something was waiting for her to come out. One night, the footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. She held her breath, her heart thundering in her chest as the doorknob began to turn. It rattled as though someone were trying to force it open. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. When she opened the door, there was nothing there but the faint scent of damp earth. The climax came on the final night. The house was alive now, its walls groaning and shuddering as though it were breathing. The whispers had become a constant presence, filling every room with their sinister chant. Evelyn tried to flee, but the front door wouldn't open, the handle refusing to budge no matter how hard she pulled. The windows were the same, their glass unyielding beneath her fists. As she stumbled into the parlor, the fire roared to life, casting the room in an eerie, flickering light. The shadows gathered in the corners, writhing and coalescing into forms that were almost human. They stepped forward, their faces blank but their eyes burning with malevolence. Evelyn backed away, her hands trembling as the figures closed in around her. She screamed as they reached for her, their hands cold and unyielding. The last thing she saw was the photograph of her grandmother on the mantel, the faintest hint of a smile curling at the edges of her lips. When the townsfolk found the house the next day, it was empty. The front door stood open, the air inside still and cold. Evelyn was never seen again, but the stories of Blackwood House grew darker, the whispers of the hollow more insistent. Some said you could still hear her screams on quiet nights, carried on the wind through the trees. And those who dared to enter the house always found the photograph on the mantel. A woman who looked just like Evelyn, her smile sharper than it had been before. Ready for more nightmares? Here comes the second story. The abyss below. Rain lashed against the windows of the little roadside motel, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Emma pulled her coat tighter around her as she fumbled with the room key, her suitcase dragging behind her. The air was thick with the smell of damp and old wood, the neon sign outside casting an eerie red glow into the hallway. Room 6. The paint on the door was peeling and the brass numbers were tarnished, but it opened easily enough. Inside, the air was stale, the dim light flickering as though unsure whether to stay on. Emma set her suitcase by the bed and let out a sigh. She was too tired to care about the mildew-stained wallpaper or the threadbare carpet. The storm had delayed her trip by hours and she just wanted to sleep. The small room was silent save for the steady drumming of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. It felt almost suffocating, but she brushed it off as exhaustion. As she unpacked her bag, something caught her eye. A photograph lay on the nightstand, yellowed with age. It showed a family of 4 standing in front of the very same motel. They were smiling, but something about their eyes felt off. She turned the photo over. Written in a scrawling hand were the words, "They never left." The first night passed uneventfully, but Emma's sleep was restless. She woke multiple times, convinced she had heard a knock at the door, but each time she checked, the hallway was empty. The rain had stopped by morning, but the oppressive gray clouds remained, hanging low and heavy in the sky. The second night was worse. It started with the static on the television. She had turned it on for background noise while she tried to read, but the channels wouldn't stay clear. The static hissed, punctuated by fleeting glimpses of distorted images. A man's face contorted in a scream, a pair of hands clawing at a window, a woman standing in a field staring directly into the camera. Emma turned the TV off, but the images stayed in her mind, vivid and unrelenting. The knocking returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. She froze, her book slipping from her hands. The knock came again, sharp and deliberate. She approached the door slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. When she opened it, the hallway was empty. Except for the photograph. It lay face up on the floor, the same family staring back at her. But now their smiles were gone, their faces twisted into expressions of terror. Emma slammed the door and locked it, her hands shaking. By the third night, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. The noises started first, a faint scratching behind the walls like rats gnawing at the wood. Then came the whispers, low and indistinct, as if spoken from the far end of a long tunnel. She couldn't make out the words, but they grew louder as the hours passed, filling the room with an oppressive hum. At 3 a.m. the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, the kind that made her feel like she was suffocating. She fumbled for her phone, using its weak flashlight to illuminate the room. That's when she saw it, a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was a man, or at least it had been. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Emma screamed and scrambled off the bed, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. The whispers had stopped. The scratching had stopped. But the air was heavy with a silence that felt alive, as though the room itself were holding its breath. By the fourth night, Emma knew she couldn't stay. She packed her bag in a frenzy, throwing clothes and toiletries in without care. She didn't care about the storm outside or how late it was. She just needed to leave. As she reached for the doorknob, her phone buzzed. A new text message. "Don't go." Her breath caught in her throat. The message had no sender, just an empty string of characters where a name should have been. Her hand trembled as she tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was undone, but the door felt as if it were sealed shut. She pulled harder, but it didn't move. Behind her, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, clearer. "Stay with us. Stay forever." She spun around, her back pressed against the unyielding door. The room was no longer the same. The walls pulsed as if alive, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal a dark, writhing substance beneath. The floor felt soft under her feet, sinking slightly with every step. Shapes moved in the shadows, too quick to see clearly. The man appeared again, standing in the corner, joined by others. A woman with half her face missing, a child clutching a ragged teddy bear, an old man whose neck twisted at an impossible angle. They stared at her, their mouths moving soundlessly. Then, in unison, they stepped forward. Emma screamed, dropping her phone as she tried to push the door open. The figures closed in, their hands reaching for her, their eyes void of anything human. The room dissolved into chaos, a cacophony of screams, whispers, and the sound of the walls collapsing inward. The last thing Emma saw was the photograph on the floor, the family now joined by a fifth figure, herself. The motel was empty when the next traveler arrived. Room 6 was locked, the key missing. The staff said no one had stayed there in years, not since the fire that had gutted the building decades ago. But sometimes, late at night, guests in the neighboring rooms would hear knocking, whispers, and the faint sound of a woman's scream carried on the wind. And if they dared to open their doors, they might find a photograph lying in the hallway, its edges burned, the faces staring out with hollow eyes. And now, onto a tale that's as eerie as it is unforgettable. The Hollow Night. The town of Alder Creek had always been a quiet place, nestled in a valley shrouded by dense, ancient woods. It was the kind of town that seemed to exist out of time, with its cobblestone streets and sagging storefronts. The townsfolk kept to themselves, their lives punctuated by the rhythmic tolling of the church bell and the occasional whispers of strange happenings deep in the woods. Mara hadn't intended to stay. Her car had broken down on the highway, forcing her to seek refuge in Alder Creek. She was on her way to start a new job in the city, leaving behind a life she was desperate to forget. But as she stood outside the inn, her breath misting in the crisp autumn air, she felt a sense of unease she couldn't quite explain. The innkeeper had handed her a key without meeting her gaze, muttering something about avoiding the woods after dark. Mara shrugged it off. She was too tired to dwell on the strange warning. But as she stepped into her room, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The room was clean but suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears and made her hyper-aware of her own heartbeat. She tried to dismiss the feeling, blaming it on the long day and the unfamiliar surroundings. The first night, she woke to the sound of tapping. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to pull her from the depths of sleep. She lay in bed, her eyes adjusting to the darkness as the sound continued, tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from the window. Swallowing her fear, she got up and approached the glass, but there was nothing outside. Just the wind stirring the trees and the pale glow of the moon filtering through the branches. The tapping stopped as soon as she stepped away. The second night was worse. Mara had spent the day exploring the town, trying to make the best of her unexpected detour. The townsfolk were polite but distant, their smiles strained. When she mentioned the woods, their expressions darkened. One old woman clutched her arm and said, "You do well to leave before the hollow night comes." Mara had no idea what she meant, but the words lingered in her mind long after she'd returned to the inn. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. She ignored it, pulling the covers over her head and squeezing her eyes shut. But the sound grew more insistent, accompanied by a faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls. Her chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't quite understand. She sat up, her breath coming in short gasps, and turned on the bedside lamp. The light flickered for a moment before steadying, but the room felt no less oppressive. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single word spoken in a voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere: run. By the third night, Mara was desperate to leave. She tried to arrange for a tow truck, but the nearest company was miles away, and the storm rolling in had made the roads impassable. The innkeeper's warnings about the woods replayed in her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't outside. It was here in this room in this town. That night, she locked the door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and sat in the corner of the room with her back against the wall. She held a flashlight in one hand and a rusted fireplace poker she'd found in the corner in the other. The tapping began almost immediately, louder and more erratic than before. The whispers followed, joined by a deep, guttural growling that made her skin crawl. The air in the room grew heavy, the temperature dropping until she could see her breath. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and twisting as though they had a life of their own. Mara's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the darkness in uneven bursts. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the far corner of the room, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce through her. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room, pressing against her like a physical weight. Mara couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare as the figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at her. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming and wailing and laughing all at once. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, and the room was plunged into darkness. When Mara woke, she was lying in the middle of the woods. The sun was rising, its pale light filtering through the trees. Her clothes were damp and covered in mud, and her hands were scratched and bleeding. She had no memory of how she'd gotten there, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. She stumbled to her feet, her body aching, and began to walk. The woods were silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the light. She tried to find her way back to the road, but every path looked the same, every turn leading her deeper into the forest. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time seemed to lose meaning as she wandered, her fear growing with each step. She started to see things out of the corner of her eye, shapes moving in the shadows, faces staring at her from the darkness. She heard the whispers again, louder now, calling her name. And then she saw it. The figure from her room stood ahead of her, its glowing eyes fixed on her. It didn't move, but the shadows around it seemed to writhe and pulse, reaching out toward her. Mara turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to shift around her, the trees twisting and contorting as though alive. She tripped and fell, her hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. When she looked up, the figure was there, standing over her. It leaned down, its face inches from hers. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it whispered, "Welcome home." Mara's disappearance was the first in a string of strange occurrences in Alder Creek. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the hollow night and the things that lurked in the woods. Some claimed to hear whispers on the wind, calling their names. Others reported seeing glowing eyes in the darkness. The inn remained empty, its doors locked and its windows boarded up. But on quiet nights, if you stood close enough, you could still hear the tapping, faint and rhythmic, echoing from within. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.